Welcome. I'm Demetra Stevenson. I am a member of the CHPP staff here at the center, and we're very excited, of course, for our next session. I have the pleasure today to have met today in person, as well as to introduce our person that you've seen before today, but she's back to help us in our next session. So I'm going to be introducing, of course, Miss Rivers. I'm sorry, Miss Rivers James. That's her. She's been a leader, of course, in property preservation movement, and she is going to be talking and help leading our next session, which is focused around Black land loss. I wanted to pause before I said that topic because sometimes when we mention that topic, it tends to draw attention. So I want to make sure we got the attention of everyone present. We're going to talk about Black land loss. After she does her presentation, then we are going to go into a short Q&A, and then we'll wrap up this session. So if you can help me, please welcome Ms. Rivers back with us today.
Well, hello again and good afternoon. All right, okay, we are doing the marathon here, and so I need y'all to stay with me, okay? Stay with me. So we're gonna shift gears a little bit from this morning. This morning was sort of a formal keynote, and we're just gonna teach and talk this afternoon, talking about the land loss, the history of land acquisition and land loss, because that really should give us a better sense of why this land is so important. And we know what the challenges are now, but the question is, how did we get here? So we mentioned a few things this morning. We're going to go into a little bit more detail about the historical roots of Black land loss. So a few things we want to highlight, picking up on what we talked about, where we left off this morning. And so African American land ownership is really unique in the South, and particularly in South Carolina. It has been well documented that freedmen in South Carolina were able to purchase property during the Civil War. On top of that, there are about 3,500 free Blacks in Charleston who had acquired property. And so we want to walk through, how is it that these people went from being considered property to owning property in such a short span of time? It's really an incredible journey. It's really an incredible journey. And so I just want to highlight a few things for us. We talked earlier this morning about the fact that the federal government had made these promises about giving people land. And how did we get there? And initially, the Lincoln administration, they did what people do now. If you don't pay your taxes, they will take your property. And so landowners down in the Sea Islands of St. Helena, Port Royal area, that was occupied by the Union Army. The plantation owners who had left and gone to the other side didn't pay property taxes to the United States government. And so the government took that property, 60,000 acres, appropriated to the federal government. And so they decided to make some of that land available to freedmen who had been set free, not enslaved, but not yet free, right? in that middle state. And the expectation of being able to get land was based on the experience of our other brothers and sisters in American history, the homesteaders. Out west, go west, young man, right? Go out, claim this property, we'll sell it to you for $1.25 an acre. Because we need you to go out there and make that livable. And so the freedmen understood this, and they said, well, wait a minute, we need some homesteads down here too. Right? We need the opportunity to get land and to farm it. Right? They're using the skills that they had brought with them from Africa and that they had learned and passed down in generations. And they knew that in an agrarian economy, how could they make it if they didn't have land to grow crops? And so I want to quote someone who made a very special speech to General Howard and talking about these Sherman lands. Because Sherman came through. We had several experiments that had happened before Sherman came. And all of this was a back and forth. Go settle the land. No, we're going to take it back. Go settle it again. No, we're going to take it back. We had missionaries from up north establishing opportunities for African Americans to work in a private industry with land contracts. And they proved that these freedmen could function in a market economy. And they were producing and making a profit. There were a lot of Northerners that came down to purchase some of that 60,000 acres, right? And so as African Americans worked these farms, eventually they looked at the missionaries, Mr. Philbrick, and said, wait a minute, we're working for you, but we want to work for ourselves. We want you to sell us some land. And so as it turns out, he did sell land to many of them for $5 an acre, which is way above the $1.25 that he had paid. But it was a charitable endeavor. And so we had folks acquiring land, pressing Philbrick to make that land available and buying it. But there's also, again, those people who didn't pay their taxes. Government took some. And when we made up this plan to stake it out and let people do preemption, word came back from DC, no, can't give it out by preemption, you have to sell it. But these freedmen, they went to the tax sale. And they were able to purchase property at that tax sale. And so they came into acquisition of land through the same tax vehicle that we are having trouble with now. But it worked at that point. It worked for us at that point. And so I want to quote this guy because Sherman came through and he had an audience with people and he entreated them to make homesteads. Right? Sherman so inspired, he issues Field Order 15, right? The Carolina coast from Charleston down through Georgia, 15 miles in from the shore, right? 1865, he said, okay, we're going to give you that. Field Order number 15. He sends a word up to DC. People settle. And then it's gone. They settled, they started crops, and then they were told, you got to go. We can't give you the title to this land. So out of the 40,000 people who took their word and went and settled this land and grew crops on it, 38,000 of them had to go. And they didn't go easily, right? It's threat of violence, because it's not unlike today. People get really touchy when you talk about their property. Right? You put your labor into the soil, and now you're telling me I can't have the benefit of it? And it takes us back to the beginning of the Carolina colony. The Lord proprietors, when we talked about this morning, they got their grants from King Charles II. And one of those proprietors was the famous philosopher John Locke. John Locke was known for influencing Thomas Jefferson. Right? Thomas Jefferson put those thoughts into the Declaration of Independence. Right? Life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. Well, John Locke was the original. He said life, liberty, and property. And Locke's work on property explained that whenever things don't belong to anybody, like we're exploring a whole new continent across the Atlantic, those people who put their labor, they mix their labor with the soil, that's what gives them a property interest. So if you work it, you should be able to own it. Except that John Locke didn't believe that Africans could get the fruits of their own labor. So we're in the colony where John Locke, the guy who said we can just take this land because we put our labor into it, and we took it from somebody else, Not only the Brits, but we took it from the Native Americans. The explanation was, well, we conquered them, and so we get the spoils. We get to keep the land. And then when America beat Britain, we said, hey, we beat you. We get to keep the land. And if we mix our labor with that property, we can settle the West at $1.25 an acre. And the freedmen said, well, we can settle the South, which had been abandoned. Parts of this coast had been abandoned. They wanted to settle it. Tax sales were important. And many of you have heard about Robert Smalls, who became a congressman. And he worked with the military. He was able to steal a ship, the Planter, right? Disguised himself and got that ship out to Union territory. But that wasn't the first famous thing he did. During those tax sales, he went and bought the house that his former owner had owned, who didn't pay his taxes. Now, I'll tell you this, I understand that that actually was his father, but he had to buy it. Everybody else gets their inheritance for free, but he had to buy it, right? So we look at this history of just speckling of an idea of owning property, but two different sets of rules. Exploration of the West, exploration of the colonies compared to exploration of the South. Sherman gives the order, and then they back up again. And in an important meeting, those freedmen had had enough. And so I want to read to you what someone explained. He said, General, we want homesteads like the West, right? We were promised homesteads by the government. If it does not carry out the promises its agents made to us, if the government, having concluded to befriend its late enemies and to neglect to observe the principles of common faith between itself and us, its allies in the war that you said was over, if you now take away from them all right to the soil they stand upon, save such as they can get again by working for your late and their all-time enemies, then we are left in a more unpleasant condition than the former. You will see that this is not the condition of really free men. It was their skill, it was their support, it was their entrepreneurial business, and it was the way to take care of their families. But despite all of that back and forth and promise and distinction between selling East and West, despite all of that, 16,000 African Americans were able to purchase over 50,000 acres of land in the Low Country and across South Carolina. Now, how did we do that? First, we had those tax sales, and those were good deeds. Right? 2,000 out of 40,000 were able to keep their preempted lands. But the Reconstruction government of South Carolina did something that was very innovative. And I think that should spark our creativity as we try to work our way through the current times. You see, the Reconstruction government created the South Carolina Land Commission. Other states didn't do that. And the Land Commission set out to purchase the plantations that had been abandoned, right? Or to purchase plantations that had been restored to the original owners, but were falling into bankruptcy because there was nobody there to work those fields. And so Francis Cardoza, he was with Avery Institute right here in Charleston. He was our Secretary of State, and he led the charge to create this commission. The commission bought up these big tracts of land and broke them up into small farms that people could afford to buy. Now, the operation of that commission raised some questions. Money disappeared, that kind of thing. A lot of the land that was sold to the commission was land that wasn't productive in the first place, so those folks got a premium on what they couldn't sell on the free market. And eventually, actually, as it worked out, more whites purchased land through that commission than blacks. But it worked. And that's how we got to a point of owning more land in South Carolina than anywhere else in the country. So it is a rich heritage. And then we go from land acquisition to land loss. 3 things I want to talk about with land loss. Right? The first thing is my crowd, the lawyers. When these folks bought up this property, right, during the war, right after the war, we had no Black lawyers, and then eventually 3 African American lawyers to service half of the state's population. So when we bought it, there wasn't really a way to get it into that preferred set of sticks, right, and joint tenancy. And so you were condemned to intestacy. Now, African American, those freedmen weren't the only people who were illiterate. Back in England, plenty of people were illiterate. And so they worked out a system that could transfer land without people writing it down. It was a ceremony, they called it livery of season. And they almost acted as if there was a spirit with the land, and they would do a little formal thing, and everybody in the community would know that someone had purchased this land. And if you didn't do that, they had a different type of estate that did function like a joint tenancy. It would combine at the next generation. But the colonists didn't like all of the combination and concentration of land and wealth that they escaped in England. And so they decided, we want to break up big estates. And so our default rule is what we found ourselves in, tenancy in common. Our ancestors, many of whom were illiterate because it was the law. The government demanded that they not know how to read. And then the government said, hey, if you didn't follow the rules, the written rules, you're stuck with that second-rate form of property ownership. So we didn't use the system that could have worked for those who were illiterate. And then we didn't have enough lawyers to help people manage their estates. We needed lawyers, and then eventually, we became the problem. People were afraid to take their deeds down to the courthouse to be recorded, because that would point out to the world, hey, I've got some. And lawyers sometimes would not do the right thing when people took their deeds in. Right? Not a part of the best history of the bar. And so lawyers contributed to land loss first by not having enough, and then sometimes they were a part of the problem. Second thing I want to talk about with land loss is takings by terror. If you raised your hand and said to the world by recording your deed, hey, I own this property, and somebody wanted your property, they'd just take it. They'd just take it. Heard the judges talk earlier about that adverse possession thing. You know, if I can prove that my use of it is hostile to yours after a certain period of time, it's mine. And researchers have found that that happens to African Americans more often than it happens to others. But worse than that, I want to quote Ray Winbush from Fisk University, and he said, if you are looking for stolen Black land, just follow the lynching trail. Back in the early 2000s, the AP report came out and talked about how African Americans were lynched, run out of town, killed, maimed for their property. Well documented, well documented. And so to have made it to acquisition of property in that Civil War era, to withstanding the attacks and terror during this Jim Crow period, to now holding on to that land, like you can't make that stuff up. Right? The history is just too rich. But now the third way that we're losing land comes from partition and encroaching development. With development coming on your shores, you wonder, well, why wasn't this partition thing a big problem before? Well, because nobody wanted it before. We picked up those bad lands. That's what they were willing to sell. And nobody cared about the coast. But then around 50s, 60s, they figured out how to build bridges, and they learned how to spray for mosquitoes, and we created air conditioning, and so then everybody wanted it. So it wasn't a problem when, the taxes were a small amount and grandma paid the taxes and everything went on as it should. But as that development came, as the golf courses came, right? Hilton Head went from a majority Black area to what, 5% Black now? And that land loss tide is creeping up the coast. We watched the video over lunch, excellent video. Right around here, right? The last group in Snowden, those are my neighbors, those are my church members. And thank God they have their spot. Because the little 4-mile community where I grew up, development came and the highway widened. And they say you can't beat City Hall, and it's hard to beat eminent domain. And so sometimes you have to get out when you can, because the growth is not going to stop coming. So that growth coming your way is great, right? Your property values are increasing. People will tell you, oh, you're from Mount Pleasant. But it's not money I can eat, because I have to live somewhere. If I sell the house, where am I going to go? It costs that much more to buy the next piece. So they try to make it sound, ooh, you're so wealthy, you're so wealthy. No, we're stuck. We're stuck. And the kids can't come live close to us because they can't afford to buy in. So we're breaking up communities section by section by section. So this land loss thing is not just a thing of the past. It's not just terrorism. It's not just in the court system. It's in the land use system, right? Remember Carl Anthony, equitable growth problem. And so on top of all of that history, the next thing I want to talk about is just dealing with the commons. Anything that's owned by a group is going to present challenges. We mentioned this earlier today, but we know when our folks are spread from South Carolina to New York and Chicago, you don't hear from some of those folks until there's an idea of selling. But if you want to get your title cleared up, now's the time to do it. Why is now the time? Because tax bills are coming out. How many of us as heirs send out the bill to everybody else? Hey, it's time for you to put in your share. Right? Tax time comes, or checks just showing up in the mail for the person who's taken on responsibility for paying those taxes? I would think not. And so when we're left to work it out on our own, it turns out that that lack of decision about the responsibilities of the land, that the law is silent, it leaves us on our own. And what it ends up with is overusers. Some people want to use all the property and not share it. And then there are freeloaders who don't want to pay their taxes. Okay? And then there are holdouts. Everybody's come up with a plan, but all it takes is one person to block it. One person. Minority shareholder control. Microsoft wouldn't take it, but we're stuck with it. So just the way that we have to own this property in common turns up in land loss. Because eventually, if grandma dies, there's nobody left to pay the taxes. And then what happens? You lose that land in a tax sale. And I've heard people say, well, we should just let it go on sheriff's sale. Just let it go. We'll get the money from the tax sale. But guess what? If it's heirs property, you still have to hire a lawyer because they're going to put all those tax proceeds in an account, and you have to prove that you're entitled to it. So I've run across cases where they're not partitioning land, they're trying to partition the money in a tax account. So as the judge said earlier, pay me now or pay me later. Might as well pay for the partition and get more for your land than to wait and deal with partitioning tax proceeds. And the case that I saw, the lawyer got $10,000, the rest of the family had to share 20. The rest of the family had to share 20. So if you have a choice, owning land as tenancy in common is not the way to do it. It's not the way to do it. So I just want you to think creatively and invite the heirs to the table so that you can come to some decisions. And so I want to share a story of land loss. It's a story along this Gullah coast of my family's land loss. I'm a native Gullah Geechee. I would have fought you 10 years ago if you called me that, but I wear it proudly now. And so this area, the little star, that's Charleston, where we're from. And when we look at Heirs Property, we look at all these pieces that fit into the puzzle. We talked about all of that, but here's what we deal with in terms of growth. Right? We talked about being from the 4-mile community. Once one business goes commercial, the rest are gonna go commercial. Right? My grandmother saw her little homestead house taxes go from $300 to $2,000, not because she started a business, but because Lowe's moved in across the road. Right? She didn't change her use, but they're gonna tax you on the highest and best use. And so now that Lowe's is there, the highest and best use of that property is commercial. So through no fault of her own, no action of her own, they multiplied her tax bill dozens of times. And when we've got heirs property on the fringe, that's not where the planning board is taking a lot of time examining what's coming in. Right? So sometimes we end up with growth and it's just bad growth because they can catch heirs property. And on my mom's side of the family, I'm a descendant of Mike Weekfall. Mike Weekfall was a slave, enslaved on Hamlin Plantation. His son, Mike Jr., was born into slavery. And in 1890, that son, Mike Jr., was able to purchase 10 acres of land from the Hamlin family that used to own him. Think about that. You sharecrop all that time to save up $10 so you can have land for your family. And they didn't give it to him. Sometimes they make you think that they didn't give it to him. We went and found the deed. He bought it. And so Mike Weekfall is a great little piece of property on Hamlin Sound, right? He had 3 daughters and that got passed down, and I'm way down at the bottom there. But what happened was, so that's the tract of land. What happened was my great-great-grandmother's piece, the little bad piece on the end with a little tip of an island down by the water. Somebody in this tree, who will go unnamed, decided that, hey, we should sell the land. And so my mother, who had that one little yellow box on the end, what was her option? She was getting ready to send me to Dartmouth. She didn't have extra money laying around to buy out the rest of the family. Well, here's what happened. This is a case that never made it to court, because this is another way that we lose land. My mother knew what the deal was. She knew that in an heirs property case, how could you win? Right? You can't outbid people. And if you hired a lawyer under the old system to object, you ended up paying both sets of lawyer fees, right? You ended up paying the lawyer who sued you out of the pool of the proceeds. So regardless, you're going to end up with less. We've changed that now in the statute. But all those people, all that land, gone. 1982. Next year, I'm off to college. Well, here's what it looks like now across the Sound. Across the Sound is Hamlin Plantation. And a couple years ago, I came home. Unfortunately, my mother became sick and she passed away. But this was a piece of property that she never stopped talking about because, as it turns out, that was going to be her only link back to her natural family. But even as we're grieving her death, one day I got a notice about an envelope. I've got to go pick it up. Remember, you can't leave those things at the post office. So I go on down to the post office and I pick up the package. And, my mom, we buried her in December, a month later, February-ish, in the depths of grief, just unexpected. And guess what's in the package? Somebody's suing me and my sister. Out of all those people on that chart, they named me and my sister. Why? I don't think she knew who I was, but she was trolling the death notices. Trolling the death notices to find out with one of those heirs, Rosalind Rivers, oh, well, she died. So those are her kids. So we'll sue her. We'll sue them. And now not only did we lose the land, then we had to go to court because I can't have default judgments, right? Got to hire another lawyer to go to court again to settle it out, just to prove that we had given up the rights to the property in the first place. Now, she could have just called me. I would have told her that. She could have just called me. But the loss goes on and on and on. So there's a lot of land loss that we don't see because people are stuck in those co-tenancies. So I just want to encourage you, really encourage you. One, if you can hold on to it, that could be your Hamlin subdivision. And two, if you don't, you always run the risk that one person in the bunch can push you to this result, losing it all. Losing it all. Now, I have to end on a positive note. On my daddy's side, my grandmother was sweet and kind, and she had settled all of her affairs. She had sectioned off her part and put it in a trust. And so my husband and I are getting ready to move into our house on daddy's side because she took it out of being Heirs Property. Mid-'80s, she had the wherewithal to figure out we need to get this settled. So don't pass it on again. Take on that charge, break the eggs, bake a good cake. So with that, I'll close and I'll open up for questions if anybody has any questions.
Wow, what a wealth of information. Thank you so much. So now we'll start questions. If anyone here has any questions, could you please come to the mic so you can ask questions? Ms. James, and she'll be more than happy to help us by answering them.
And I may not have all the answers, but I'll do my best. I may have to call on Josh. I saw Josh earlier.
Yes,
Yes, sir.
The question that I have is that I have on my father's side, we have a piece of property out in the St. Stephen's area that we found out that one of our forefathers, we just had to sell off a section of it to pay the taxes and things of that nature, but there's like 9 more acres that's left. And we got some family that's, that bitter rivalry, competition type thing. What is the best course? You said break the eggs. What's the best course of action to kind of get that ball rolling? Because one, we don't want to give up the property. And then two, even though we have those family members that are kind of, problematic, we still want it to be a family legacy, but we want to make sure that it's taken care of and that it remains in the family as opposed to losing it to tenancy in common.
And so congratulations on maintaining that land in the family first. And it is a good strategy to sell a piece if that gives you enough proceeds to pay the taxes and take care of the land, right? There are other things you could do. You could timber the property and create proceeds that could pay property taxes, right?
We just was talking
So,
about Heirs Property.
but with what's left, you have to own it in common, but it doesn't have to be tenancy in common. So the family could come together and put their interest in a trust. They could put their interest into an LLC, sort of a simplified small business. And all you're trying to do is get it to a state where you're not run by minority shareholder control. Right? When you put your interest in, you agree that, hey, if I want out, I'll let y'all buy me out first. And so there are ways to own property together. There are even tenancies in common that come with agreements. So you're taking it out of being heirs property, but all you're saying is, here's how we're going to deal with the land. And we're going to have people take responsibility for their share of the taxes and other costs. And if we timber, we're going to share the income with everybody else. And so really, I think now that this has been brought to the surface, this also, I would say, happens with eminent domain. For the government to take your property for a highway, they've got to figure out who the heirs are. That's when you should go ahead and clear up your title, right? So take the opportunity now that you know who's there to try to go ahead and clear the title. Yes, sir.
Right. First of all, excellent presentation, wealth of information. I just finished reading a book called The Color of Law, which primarily dealt with urban areas in this country and the history of predatory actors. Can you recommend a book or two that deals with the Gullah or the Gullah region in terms of the history that you just laid out, or were you considering perhaps authoring a book?
Oh, thank you. I think about that. I got a lot of stories to tell. Thank you. So I would say this. There's actually a fiction book that I really like. It's by, I think it's Lorraine Carey. And the title is If Not Sons, Then Heirs. And although it's fiction, it tells the story of a family in the midst of a land loss crisis. And she even mentions the Center for Heirs Property in the book. So it's a good way of seeing how this can happen. But I do think The Color of Law is a good book because it really does point out how the discriminatory practices of our government continue to impact us as African Americans. Right. And so, our forefathers who came back from the war, they couldn't buy houses in neighborhoods with everybody else. There were restricted covenants, and the government said, we're not giving you money unless you have a neighborhood that says no Black people can live here. And so our folks didn't have the benefit of that. Without access to the mortgage market, I used to wonder when I was a little kid riding through the country, like, you see a half-built cement block house. You're like, I wonder why they stopped building that house. They ran out of money because there were no banks to borrow from. So I do think The Color of Money, even though it's in an urban context, it helps you see the systemic challenges of how discrimination and discriminatory laws impact our wealth and the ability to pass it on. But I'll take your advice about the other thing.
Absolutely.
Appreciate that. Yes, ma'am.
Good evening. My concerns are similar to his with what exactly is out there for families that are actually trying to work together to make things, better. I'd like to hear how many different options are there.
All
Just
right.
put it kind of simplified for me so I can know, because we've looked at LLC or the family compound, I think it was. But I want to hear it so I can make sure that we're covering everything. Right.
So here's my suggestion. It's just from my story. LLCs are great if you have a group of young people who are going to manage it like a business and do the filings and all of that. I personally think that's a little bit more than our older generation are willing to bear. And the young people, if you've got an ancestor living, let me be clear about this. If your ancestor is living, you don't own anything yet.
Right.
right? All you have is the hope of inheritance, so be good to daddy and mom, right? So you can get it into that business form, but the people who own the interest may not understand and be able to effectively manage the company.
Right.
So I personally think a trust is a good method, but everybody still has to deed their stuff into, and clear the title so that it goes into the trust with a clear title. And the trust will have trustees who manage the property. This is a leadership lesson I learned off in Williamsburg County. An older man said to me, Mr. Jerry Edwards, the problem with what we're dealing with is that anything with two heads is a monster.
Mm-hmm.
And so you need to put your faith and trust in a decision maker who will handle the land on your behalf. And if they mess up, you have other avenues, but clear that title and put it into something. Now, another thing you might do, let's say there are 5 branches of the family, and each branch gets along with themselves, but not the others. So if you can't divide that 20 acres into 100, maybe you could divide it into 4 or 5. And each branch could take theirs with a clear title and manage that as a unit. So think creatively about what segment you can deal with.
Okay.
Who can you collaborate with? But on top of all that, I guess I would say, disagreements are not good, but they're part of every family. Sometimes when you get down to the problem at the heirs property table, they're really just ticked off because you didn't do X at daddy's funeral. And so if you can unravel that through mediation, right? Mediation is an excellent way to give people a voice. Because if you can get all that on the table, then they're more able to look at the big picture. And if you explain to them, look, we could lose this. We could lose it. In the midst of doing all this, people have to step up and organize it. And it may be that you have to say, well, I'm interested in holding on to the land. So if you want out, I'll buy you out. We can't control their interest and not pay. Unfortunately, that means we're paying twice for what we have, but that's the only way to get them out because they've still got some of our sticks. So I would look at a corporate entity, but I would start with mediation and a center workshop with everybody there at the table so they can hear, and hopefully they won't be like that little old lady saying, I don't care what that lawyer said.
Okay, so what you're saying, the options, basically?
Options would be clear the title. Right?
Okay,
you got to clear the title.
Yeah.
And then
that's
put it
understood.
into some sort of joint ownership. An LLC if that's for you, a trust, or even a tenancy in common with an agreement.
Repeat that?
A tenancy in common with an agreement. So these are called ticks, but they're not bad things. This is the way that some people will own a beach house.
Okay.
Instead of having a condo association and a timeshare. Instead of a timeshare fee, you are a tenant in common with an agreement, so you own 1/10 of it so you can afford it and you get 3 weeks out of the year.
Right.
I don't talk about that a lot because I want people to get confused, but you could do the same thing with the trust. Right?
Gotcha.
You could do the same thing with the trust.
Okay, yeah. I was just looking for the number of options that are out there.
And I'll suggest, I have another article, I didn't bring copies of this, but it's available online. And I kind of walk through at the end some of those options, challenges, and opportunities. Partnerships can work too, but I think they can be a little fickle. So
Someone was asking what the question was. I was basically trying to explore the options of what is there that the family, once they decide how to work together, what options are there out there for the family to invest in and to be, begin working on.
Right.
And that was the answer.
And again, sign up for a center workshop and they will walk you through all those steps.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello.
Good afternoon.
I just want to make a comment and maybe a question. The Center for Heirs Property came about because of the black land loss. Am I right about that? Or they saw a need?
Saw a need.
With all the things that have happened to people of color in reference to their property, why isn't, I don't understand why the government and lawyers and the judges that sat up here today isn't trying to make things right. For example, that family that lost their land, their beach 97 years ago, they reclaimed it. I would tell everybody, don't give up hope on your land. Fight for it and try to keep it in the family. And Congress and the government needs to make things right so that these people get their property back. They know we weren't treated right. And that's why the trust is not there. And it's hard for people in their 70s and 80s. They don't understand. That's why the Woodland community advocates are here to help you people. So please take it back to your communities. Let us help you and keep your land. But whoever's listening on the airways, let's make this right for our people to get their land back. We were cheated, it's wrong. Clemente Pinckney has that. Do any of us have a copy of his act that he did? Could we get a copy of that, someone from the center, at least to the WCAs? And let's help each other. Let's work toward this. There was a lot of things you said you're gonna end with a good note at the end of it. Well, we need to get this property back and make things right. They know we were treated wrong, and our people didn't understand. I want to fight for those people.
I will say this. I was inspired to go to law school because I didn't want things like what happened to my mother to keep happening to people. And so you're gonna have to have somebody on your side. So choose carefully, but you're empowered with a lawyer. And I will also tell you that when I ran the Bar Foundation, I headed up the National Association of Bar Foundations. And when I would go around the country and explain to them that the bar was working with the foundations on heirs property, they're like, what? But here's the deal. I've done real estate development. The hard thing, and you heard the judge say it today, the act just gives you a detailed list of what good judges would do. It's what good judges would do. When someone's trying to do a real estate deal, it takes a lot of time, and you pay for site control, and you do it at market rates. And just because the family standing in front of you are heirs, they're no different than the Rockefellers fighting over their inheritance. And if you can figure out how to divvy up 100 acres for the Rockefellers, we can use those same strategies, appraisers and surveyors, to come in and figure out how to equalize the shares, if it's with 5 people or 5 units of families. And so all the act does is says, hey, we know how to do real estate transactions, and all we have to do is put those same steps in partition. So it is a start. It is an opportunity. Not all states have adopted it, but South Carolina has. And so it really does give us an opportunity. But remember, partition is last resort. We can fix it if we can agree. Now, where land has been stolen by adverse possession, sometimes that adverse possession works against you, where they say they're not going to unravel it. But if the government owns it, perhaps the government should look at giving it back. One more story I want to add to that. My grandmother, she took care of her property, and one day she got a letter in the mail and said, 1 sheet, please sign below and return. It was an option to buy her property from the state, from the Port Authority. They were going to run a train across this pristine area to Daniel Island. If she had not had me and signed because it was from the government, what would have happened? So that Black, Green, White Equitable Growth Coalition, they stopped that rail line. But some people had already signed that letter. And so the government said, we'll give it back to you for money. We give us our money back, we'll give you your land back. But y'all know what happened to that money, right? So you couldn't buy it back because they bought TVs, because it wasn't enough to do much with. Right? So we need allies. Right? If it weren't for that coalition coming together, that train track would be running right now and I'd have no house. All right, next.
All right, so I will be reading 3 questions from our virtual platform. The first one is, where eminent domain is an issue, does clearing the title preserve the land?
No. Let me be clear, no. The challenge is the government has a right to the property. Right? Go back to our history lesson. We talked about the folks in England, and they came and conquered the Native Americans. They did that, and they said, okay, all the government belongs to the crown. And that means that the government is supreme. The government is just letting us buy property, but they can come in and take it back. Now, the restrictions are that they can take your property, but they have to take it for a public purpose, and they have to give you just compensation. Public purpose has evolved, but the just compensation part, here's the rub. If you object to the price being too low and you lose in court, now you've got to pay your lawyer's fees and you get less. Faced with a similar situation, here's what I did. We got a notice. They were going to take a relative's piece of property. And so I got busy. I erased some property lines. I made a big parcel and I got a contract. And I called them back and I said, hey, got a contract, which proves my value. You can pay it or they can pay it. Doesn't make any matter to me. Make any difference to me. Well, they found someplace else to put that thing. So working on your value is important, but clearing it doesn't stop them from taking it. Leaving it as heirs property doesn't stop them from taking it. What they will do is that they will start the action to clear the portion, the title to the portion that they are taking from you.
Okay. Second question, how do you get rid of a narcissistic relative not willing to reason?
Okay. All right,
This is the question.
let's give you some time. Go start over.
How do you get rid of a narcissistic relative not willing to reason with the balance of heirs property owners?
That the person may be narcissistic, but what do they have? Where's my stick? They got a piece of that stick. So what you might do is if they want to proceed with clearing up their title so that they've got good title, the rest of the group could start the partition action. And then if they are in a state with the Uniform Act, they can exercise the right of first refusal to buy you out. So you don't have to always look at the statute as being victimized by it. You can use it if it enables you to get someone who's too much of a challenge to work with you.
All right, thank you. Last question. What entity is best, an LLC, corporation, or trust?
I personally would recommend a trust. Once you set up a trust, it carries on. An LLC, as I mentioned earlier, has a recurring annual set of expectations and rules. So I personally would recommend a trust. You could have a board of trustees, perhaps representing each branch of the family, and that board could manage the trust on behalf of the family. Yes.
I just want to congratulate you just on the fascinating research you've done. I've learned so much just listening to you. I'm from Florida, so we kind of predate that Lords of London proprietorship you're speaking about. And I think it's important, as being a descendant for me of the Gullah Geechee Nation, we extend past beyond the oldest city in Florida, St. Augustine, really all the way down into the Bahamas. So it's very critical that we expand the dialogue, because a lot of the fundamental ideas and modeling that we're coming up with to shape heirs property, particularly as it relates to the Gullah Geechee Nation, is on the surface. It's very much on the surface. So I want to encourage you to definitely come and visit us. 1660, when you spoke about John Locke, that was before Charlottetown, the first settlement in Charleston. And it was also before 1734, the first settlement of Georgia with Oglethorpe, 1733. And all of that predated the Civil War, by 130 years. So when we talk about and think about our presence basically in the United States, I do want to encourage you to get deeper into your genealogy. It expands way beyond our earliest imagination in terms of our native roots as well, and how that law, how those laws support us. My question to you is, do you see heritage tourism or ecotourism as a model for economic development, and do you support reparations in this space?
All right. So I will say this.
I think our time is up. Go ahead, answer that one, but how much time do we have? 4 minutes?
Okay.
Thank you. You answer that one, and then we'll close it out. But any extra questions, we will get them answered, guys. Thank you for holding on with us.
All right. So I will say this, and you talked about sort of looking beyond the traditional and thinking creatively. Honestly, I think it was that kind of creativity that even launched the Heirs Property Act, the Uniform Act. Because we talked about that tick thing. It's not just us, right? Even people who leave a will and they say, to my 3 children to share and share alike, if they don't use the magic phrase for joint tenancy, they're in the same situation. And so when we explain that to people in the Northeast, that's what brought the collaborative group together at an ABA meeting to say, hey, we need to study heirs property. And then that turned into, hey, we need to draft a statute. So finding out people who've got a common issue and agenda is really important to find a creative solution. Anything that can help you make money on your land while you still own it, I think is very positive. So ecotourism, great. I would check one thing. Does the ecotourism transfer agricultural use to a commercial use? I would check on that first, because that changes your tax structure and you end up like my grandmother's little house going from 300 to 2,000. So I'd be careful about that. Reparations. Yeah. Right. I think that is part of the design of the corridor. So it is my hope that we can bring people down and educate them about, it's not just our history, right? Most of the people who were enslaved in the United States came through Charleston, right? The museum will be open soon. They came through the port of Charleston. And so everybody needs to know where their roots are. It wasn't a celebration like Ellis Island to get off at Sullivan's Island to quarantine, but we're here nonetheless. And so we've got to celebrate the strength that it took to survive those things. That would empower our young people, I believe. With reparations, to me, I don't see it happening. And so I would like to focus their attention and work on making things fair now. I'd take fairness now over what we have. And so that has been my focus, the focus of my work. But I would say if you can find a blip in your title that will enable you to reverse something, pursue it. Get a lawyer. Get a lawyer. And never let people start edging on your boundary, because then they may try to take it. Even if you put up just a little fence corner on your post, do that. All right, y'all. Well, thank y'all so very much. I really enjoyed seeing everybody.